Evolutionary theory and the freedom of human consciousness often seem to be at odds with each other. If we think of human consciousness as something that is dictated and determined by our evolutionarily adapted impulses, it's hard to maintain our understanding of it as being free, because if it's determined by impulse and by evolution, it is essentially a physical phenomenon, and we don't have freedom. We are just the mechanical results of a complex series of evolutionary processes. There are, of course, many metaphysical explanations of how this might not be the case, that maybe the universe is inherently conscious. But I think even if we go down the line of evolutionary theory, it is not the case that everything is still determined. Because even though we are, well, if we take that evolutionary perspective and we say that we are determined by our evolution, that doesn't mean that the things that we have, our consciousness, is entirely reducible to evolutionary principles. Essentially, the argument I'm trying to make is that consciousness has an evolutionary value, but that it is not reducible. Consciousness has to be this open thing. It has to be something where we're free. So it's useful. It is evolutionarily adaptive to have freedom and to have openness and novelty and new things, new free will. So even though it might only exist, our consciousness might only exist to serve an evolutionary purpose, that doesn't mean that it has no value, and that doesn't mean that it isn't real. It just means that we can trace a lot of what's in our consciousness back to evolution and understand ourselves better. But we are still free, because it is valuable to be free. Sigmund Freud wanted to make all of his psychology traceable back to evolutionary theory. He wanted psychology to be a form of evolutionary science. And the reason he wanted that was to put it on a firm scientific footing, because psychology was a very new discipline, and it was often considered to be a little bit woo-woo. And that's actually quite fair at the time, because some of the most reputable psychologists preceding Freud were hypnotists from France. So understandable that he wanted to be a little bit more strict. So he tried to become sort of an evolutionary theorist. So, in that vein, Freud theorized that the organisms that exist today are the ones that have a long ancestry of successfully surviving and reproducing. Organisms that didn't survive, didn't reproduce, and their genes and the corresponding phenotypes are no longer in circulation. Also in the ancestry, if an organism was able to survive but not reproduce, their genes also don't survive to today. So whatever phenotype they had, however they were, whatever they looked like, whatever properties they had, they haven't survived either. Freud's conclusion from this was essentially that if an organism has not had a long history of successfully sexually reproducing, then they would not have survived. So any organism that exists today has a long history, ancestral history, of successful sexual adaptations. And it's for this reason that Freud reduced all human motivation to sexuality, because from an evolutionary perspective, all adaptations come down to facilitating successful reproduction. Freud's student Carl Jung initially agreed with Freud in his assessment of human motivation, but he took it a little bit further, because where Freud thought everything was reducible to sexuality, Jung started to notice that this seemed like a little bit of a short circuit, that Freud would see a problem and he would immediately conclude that there is some contortion of a sexual impulse which has resulted in whatever neurotic condition he observed in his patient. Jung saw that there was more complexity to the situation, and he developed a theory where human motivation was more than mere canalized or channeled sexual impulse. A good example of this difference here would be the instinct of hunger. Now, from a Freudian perspective, hunger is a channeled version of sexuality. The sexual impulse requires the sustenance of the organism in order to reach its end of sexual union. So Freud would reason that hunger is a stepping stone to exactly sexual reproduction, so that the actual motivating factor for hunger is not independent. It is merely a necessary evil It is a roadblock in the way of the sexual instinct, so that the impetus behind hunger is actually sexual. Now, while this does seem to fit in line with the evolutionary theory, where we're here because our ancestors were able to reproduce, it does seem like a short circuit. In general, I think we can all agree, yeah, we're here because our ancestors could reproduce, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every feature of our anatomy is directly related to our ability to reproduce. And it's the same with our motivations. Of course, all of them exist because they aided in our ability to reproduce. But that doesn't mean each one is directed specifically toward reproduction. Whereas for Freud, that's really what it was. The only conscious motivation, the only fundamental human motivation was sex. Because of this, Jung supposed that humans may well come to the world built in with a set of distinct drives. He reasoned that it would make sense that since every single organism to ever live needed to sustain itself through food, that every organism would have a pre-built motivation toward needing food. In saying this, he distanced himself from Freud, because Freud, as I've said, believed all impulses to be channeled versions of the fundamental impulse of sex, whereas this distinct feature that Jung had, where maybe we come to the world with multiple already distinct motivations, that really threw a spanner in the works of the Freudian theory. Now you might be wondering why these two theories relate to evolutionary freedom, as I explained in the beginning of the video. And essentially what I'm trying to say here is that Freud thought everything was reducible to the evolutionary principle of sexual reproduction. Jung thought that when we reduce our motivations to a biological principle, it is not unitary. It is disparate, various, there are multiple motivations, but at the end our motivations are reducible. But as Jung matured, he recognized that all of these built-in motivations would always be insufficient. And so there is a need for a sort of fluid, liquid motivation that can apply to different things. So the dynamics of Freud's sexual theory would be that it's very open. This libido, sexual impulse, can get its hooks into anything, and it can adapt, and it's very fluid. This isn't the case for all of the inbuilt impulses. They predict their object to a degree. Hunger, you can perhaps channel towards different outputs, but in the end of the day, it really just means put food in body. But no matter how many impulses we have that can help us in the environment that we're likely to be born into, those impulses will always be insufficient. So we need something else to guide us and to allow us to adapt to whatever situation we find ourselves in. And that is the evolutionary value of consciousness. So if Freud thought everything had to be reduced to the libido because of evolution, Jung really replaced that with consciousness. We have this consciousness, we evolved this consciousness for a reason, and it has value. So, but when we look at our consciousness and we say we're reducing this consciousness essentially to consciousness. Why do we have consciousness? Because evolution says it's good to have consciousness. This doesn't actually explain anything. So essentially, it means that consciousness becomes this sort of bottomless pit, which is to say, we can't trace back our consciousness to anything. We can't trace back our motivation to anything. It exists in and of itself because that is valuable. We have evolved an adaptive capacity. The purpose of consciousness is so that we can attend to the novelties of our own experience. No instinct can predict it. So consciousness has value. Consciousness is real. Consciousness is not merely an artifact of evolution. Or even if it is an artifact of evolution, that doesn't mean that it isn't true consciousness. It is not reducible to anything. If it were, it would not be able to predict all future events. It would not be adaptable to the infinite possible array of future events. So even though we can look from this evolutionary perspective at consciousness, we can't deny its validity. It is still free, it is still open, because it has to be. If it were restricted to any mechanism, it wouldn't serve its purpose. So We may get into the metaphysics of consciousness, why it's necessary despite a mechanical physical world. But at the end of the day, even if we live in a mechanical physical world, we still have a freedom in consciousness.